really wonderful to have you and to hear about this work. I have a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. One of the first things I was thinking about is, clearly the ability to use data and machine learning and other technologies has come a long way very quickly in the last few years and has really opened up what you're able to do. I'm wondering two things. One is, where do you see the challenges moving forward in how you're able to use what's available? And also, how does that change how you think about even approaching the questions? Do you ask different questions because now you have access to things that you didn't think you did before?
I can go first. I think one big challenge that we're starting to see is interpretability. Like, it's one thing to build a big neural network that can predict various kinds of things pretty well, but then it's also important to understand why it's making these predictions. And so it's kind of like moving from correlation to causation and try to really understand why we're seeing the kind of predictions that the model is producing. That's a big problem that from a technical point of view, it's something that we don't know how to address, and so I think it's raising some very, very interesting kind of research questions that we're thinking a lot about in my group.
I guess for us the challenge is trying to go back in the past. We learn a lot from looking at history, and Landsat data goes back to the 70s, but it's not yet clear that we can do much with that imagery if we don't have the corresponding training data set from that time period. So it's kind of like, well, if we train a model on today's imagery, can we then use it to kind of like predict backwards what was going on? And if we can do that, that'd be amazing, because then we can actually have time series and start really thinking through a lot of questions much more thoroughly than we can now. But we don't know yet whether it's, my hope is in Stefano. So that's going to be, and then, so maybe we'll never be able to go back in time so much. Then we want to make sure that what we build is going to be usable prospectively, to build comparable things over time. And one question I have, and maybe it's for Stefano, which is like, well, as imagery gets better and better, that's good for the quality of a prediction at a point in time. But does it mean that comparability across years in predictions is actually going to be compromised? And that's, I think, a question for a data scientist.
Yeah, I'll answer maybe just in a complimentary way, certainly agreeing completely with what they're saying and admiring their work very much. The third dimension here is just, even while we're lighting up the world with new information and new approaches, at the same time, in many places, it's as if we're going into a dark ages in terms of how political leaders are thinking about options. And it's, we're very vulnerable to moving down paths that can be extremely destructive. So the one big focus of our effort is to develop training across ministries at kind of that level in governments to open up awareness of all this new ability and access to it. And an example is we're running a series of trainings actually out of Beijing, where there's a lot of interest on the part of countries that are in the Belt and Road Initiative arena, the roughly 70 countries that are possibly going to experience this $1 trillion or more infrastructure investment coming mostly from China and beyond in Latin America and other places. So we're engaging people both at the policy level, a lot of people in economics and development banks and such, and then also people, sort of younger technical staff of ministries and development banks, so that they are able to use these tools. And then getting back to your question, maybe we could have another round. It completely changes kind of what we work on. There's so much science to do, sort of in every direction of 360 degrees. So we're trying to work on problems where there is some political will to address them, and where there's opportunity to demonstrate this pathway to green growth and ideally see it replicated.
Thanks. Wonderful. So in our audience today, we have many of our corporate members from the Stanford Data Science Initiative coming from a variety of different companies. And I'm wondering, what role industry can play in the work you do. Have you had any partnerships that have resulted in positive things? And are there things you imagine in the future that could help this kind of work move forward from the industry perspective?
Sure, I'll say we've worked with a number of major companies, Dow Chemical Corporation, Coca-Cola, Unilever. Now we're working with a suite of corporations in a particular context, and I'll just give one example. So a lot of our work has focused on supply chain management, and certainly that was with Dow Chemical is mostly, they have most of their assets along coastlines, and they're extremely vulnerable to climate risks. And they've asked us questions about the value of marshes and other coastal natural features in securing their assets. But anyway, on the supply chain side with Unilever, and now working actually with a neat consortium involving NASA as one of the funders, a big mining company called OT, a subsidiary of Rio Tinto in Mongolia, and then a company called Caring that, I don't know how many have heard of it. It's one of the biggest kind of clothing companies, in the holding companies. It has many brands, and they're sourcing cashmere from Mongolia. And what we're trying to develop together with NASA and the mining company, the government, conservation groups, and so on, is a system where we can have real-time tracking of herders that are supplying and incentivized to supply very high-quality cashmere that depends on not overgrazing. And we have the mining company offsetting its impacts by helping to invest in this, and all these other partners lined up to ensure that the herders that are sustaining the system better for its many, many benefits to society of clean water and stable climate and other things beyond the cashmere product, that all of that is happening all through data science, which I'm sure we can improve on, and that's the NASA piece, but we're very keen to advance in other directions. But that's an indication where we would have just real-time tracking on a week-to-week basis of the conditions across the world's grasslands, how much grazing intensity could be sustained, what the value of the resulting product is, and kind of line up the incentives so that you have, again, that green growth, the improvement in livelihoods and human well-being at the same time as you're driving investments and sustainable, improvement in the life support systems that sustain everything.
Yeah, another example, like the work I presented on predicting crop yields, that was actually a collaboration with a company that was part of the SDSI. So we kind of like scoped out that project. It was an insurance company, and they were interested in building a better way of kind of like tracking crop yields that was more scalable, and they could apply it to, say, developing countries. And so that's an example of a collaboration of a project that was relevant. It was of interest to an industrial partner, but of course then it could have had a lot of other potential applications, and to the World Bank and to other kind of institutions that think about those kind of problems. On the other side, I think that there's a lot of value in terms of providing data. We're starting to talk to telecommunication companies to see to what extent we can get access to their data. I think we're talking to say companies like Planet Labs and then the companies that actually own the satellites. I think there are a lot of interesting synergies that can be built there in terms of they provide data to us, we develop techniques to analyze the data and kind of it's kind of like a nice synergy in the sense that they get value out of this, in the sense that their data is more useful to us, but also to other people, to other customers, and we get access to the best data and essentially at no cost, that allows us to scale up in a much nicer way.
Just 30 seconds. Actually, I find it very hard to get people to give me data. In particular, telecommunication data. I think it's. I mean, there's a host of things that can be done that's not good with this data. So maybe that's why. But it's very difficult to get, in particular, providers in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's kind of like the only source of data we have on people that can be very useful. And there's this one data set from Rwanda that one researcher got his hand on 7 years ago. And so for like 3 years, we know every single phone call that was made in Rwanda. And then that's since then, that's it. Like that's the only telecommunications data set that's been useful for economists doing research. And it's a pity because we can, actually that researcher was able to show that you can do pretty nice poverty mapping as well, just using cell phone records, because people's communication patterns on the phone tells you a lot about how well they are doing. And so it'd be really nice, if we could get, Orange to give them, to give us some data. We could do a lot, but I think it's much harder than that I thought it would be to get that. So any help is welcome.
So thanks. Why don't we open up questions to the audience? Is there anyone who would like to ask a question of the panel?
I'm just curious if you're looking at certain attributes or layers, almost like a simulation. You've talked about predicting, how the society or a particular country would develop, like roads and infrastructure, and what would be the impact on riches versus poverty. Is that something that you guys are looking at as well? Just out of curiosity. So if I put a road in here, it's going to impact this side of town, it's going to become poorer, and that side of town is going to, that type of thing.
So that's something that economists have looked at in a number of contexts. So there are some studies. If you're interested, I'm happy to send you references. People have looked at the effects of roads, of railroad, bridges, and things like that. Now, what's really tricky is that typically you don't just put a road, just here instead of there, just out of sheer, randomness. And so you put the road here because precisely you think that this is the important area where you want things to happen. And so actually teasing out the effect of the road independently of what would have happened anyway, because this is where activity is happening, is the tricky part. And so the type of studies that people have been able to do is really constrained by the fact that you need to have some credible way of teasing it out. And so I can give you one example, which is, countries that had decided to put a capital in the middle of the country at some point, like Brasilia. And then they created a road network that goes from Brasilia to every single province. And then you can say, well, I can actually just trace a straight line from Brasilia to, the main city in that province. And then I can say every single town which happens to be on that straight line is lucky because they just got, a road, just because they are in between, right, compared to a city or a town that would be just like 100 kilometers away. And so from that, you can look at the effect of now being much closer to a road on the activity in that city. So that's one example. So there are studies, maybe like 7 or 8 that I know off the top of my head that are what we call well identified. They can really tell you what this infrastructure did. But there are not a ton of opportunities to do that well, and so we don't know as much as we would like to.
Did anybody else want to?
I'll mention 2 other things complementing what Pascaline said. So one is that we're at the same time need to measure not only the benefits of infrastructure to people, but the impact of infrastructure, on surrounding areas and the need of infrastructure over the long run for nature. And a good example has to do with roads. So we work a lot with hydropower, which is expanding rapidly worldwide. And often roads go in the same arena, same geography where you're going to have hydropower. But roads, if it's a forested area, as many hydropower sites would be in upland regions, they tend to spawn deforestation. And that's really damaging then to hydropower, to the long-term economic returns from hydropower, because forest acts as a sponge, soaking up the water and holding it, kind of meeting it out gradually so that you have year-round supply rather than just say the 3 months of the monsoon when there happens to be precipitation. And also forest holds sediment back, many other benefits for hydropower. So that's a key example. And then it raises the whole new arena of green infrastructure. So we're working a lot in cities now, developing the software Invest specifically for cities and looking at combinations of green and gray infrastructure to protect cities, many of which are along coastlines where sea level is rising, protect from inundation, and help cool cities with climate extremes, temperature extremes that are coming. So there's more and more investment planned in some cities, wealthier cities in the world today, to help ameliorate this heat island effect, help maintain things like just mental health, school kid performance, worker performance. There are all these connections between the amount of green space in and around cities and human health and well-being. So we're trying to draw these out. We're at kind of the early stages, but are partnered with the San Francisco Bay Area, with 5 major cities, the biggest in China, and some other cities around the world in developing this work, again, in a kind of co-development way.
Okay, thanks. One more question I just came to my mind. Everyone who works with data often has a problem where you're trying to use disparate data sets that have different resolutions, different attributes that don't lend themselves well to one another. And this seems like a problem that could be particularly challenging in this arena where you're getting data from many different sources that are in different types of varieties and shapes and sizes. And I'm wondering, have you learned anything in what you're doing that you think could apply to other fields based on what you've done?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a challenge that we've encountered multiple times, both in terms of the inputs, like let's say satellite images coming from different sensors, and they have to be, or even across different times, and you have to either develop a different model for each kind of image, or sometimes some are available somewhere but not somewhere else, and so it becomes really, really painful to kind of like come up with a principled way of approaching that. One of the things that we did was to develop these sort of like multi-scale models where we were able to feed in kind of like and sort of like latent variable models where we're sort of saying we model everything at the same time, and then what's available, if something is available, we feed it in as an input, and if it's not available, then we basically integrate it out, we marginalize it out. This is all probabilistic, so we can sort of like capture uncertainty, and we can essentially predict what it should have been and kind of like deal with the fact that the data is missing. In terms of the outputs, that's also another big problem, like the way things are measured differently in different countries in different years. And we have a lot of problems with kind of like data quality, like we're training our models based on survey data that we know is not perfect. And I don't know much about that, but my colleagues like Pascaline and Marshall, I know they spend a lot of time thinking about what's the right way to normalize the data, to clean the data, to make sure that we get access to the best data possible. And it's not as good as the kind of things that we typically have in machine learning, but it's often good enough that we can still build reasonable models.
More questions?
This one. I was listening to NPR just this morning, and there was a short segment on this company based out of San Francisco that's doing community redesign for climate change. Like their argument was, if you have a soccer field in a flood zone or a new flood zone, it's a lot safer than putting a building there. Do you guys see any of that, or is that a economic opportunity to think about 10 years down the line how our cities should be defined and how they should be designed?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of that happening actually here in the Bay Area. I had been thinking along Highway 101 that, it was more shopping malls going in the places where there's a lot of construction. But a whole bunch of that in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties is part of a more than $100 million investment in the possibility of a 3-meter sea level rise. So there's actually conversion of a golf course into a recreational kind of marshland area because the high tides are already getting quite a lot higher. And then there's just a lot of discussion underway now. When you look at where infrastructure is located, it's all the gas, the electric lines, the water lines, and obviously transportation all along that 101, Highway 101 area. And if you look around the bay, any climate kind of an extreme event would have a massive sort of rippling effect through the area. So there is a lot of planning underway exactly for that, and trying to quantify, what the returns on different investment options would be, and trying to get the most out of each investment in sort of the green infrastructure that you're alluding to.
Hi, I'm Joe Bockhorst from American Family Insurance, and so my question is on the causality issue that you raised. It seems like from a data science perspective, I'd like to hear, and also it seems like it's really important for being able to do something about what these models predict, that we understand causality. So my question is, I guess, to talk about that, or also what can be done if we can't do interventions. I mean, if we can intervene, we can get causality through that way, right? But if we don't have the ability or power to do the intervention and see the resulting response, what kind of things can we do in order to discover that causality?
So are you asking about causality, like how you do an intervention, it changes the outcomes for the people, or are you asking about attribution within the machine learning? Attribution? No. Oh, so it's for you.
I think the question is like, how can you infer something about causality from observational data, and then whether that's possible. And we know, I mean, there are limitations to what you can do, of course. I mean, there's something that can be done using, do calculus and all those kind of, but it's all based on assumptions, right? And so, that there are some tools that can be used there, but there are fundamental limitations. Yeah, I mean, I think
And also, it's not obvious that you need to pin down causality for it to be useful. Yeah, so because what you care, for many questions, what you care about is prediction. You want to be very good at predicting. That's what policymakers may care about. Understanding exactly why you got the prediction right is almost second order. So I think depending on what you're after, causality. I mean, for me, causality is like key, because I'm trying to understand. Okay, how can this be used for in other contexts? And so for me, knowing whether X causes Y or not is fundamental. But for me to be able to tell a policymaker as well, if you want to know, where you're likely to see Y, you can look at where you see X. That can be good enough. So I think, I do think it'd be great to get further along on the attribution side, but it's whatever we can do without it is already very useful, I think.
Adding to that, also, like, just bringing accountability, like, to the sector it's already huge, and you don't need causality to do that. It's just being able to track what's going on with high spatial and temporal resolution. It's already huge, because it's kind of like, it's bringing accountability in a sector where there is basically nothing is known, right? So it's already a big step forward.
I'll add, since we're waiting to see if someone else wants to pose a question, but I just say on the biophysical side, there are decades of work in a lot of the arenas, like on the value of forest for drinking water supply or hydropower production. And all of those models are process-based, so they involve the causal mechanism that's been pretty well demonstrated over a long time in many kind of climate zones around the world. But all of what they say certainly applies to the part of the modeling where we're inferring from imagery what's actually going on.
One more question that I have is, satellite images obviously play a huge role in the work that you do and have provided very dense data for a long time. And you've mentioned that cell phone data would be another useful data set. I'm just wondering, where the future lies, and we heard earlier in the day about personal sensing and the smartwatches that people are wearing, education before that, and all the novel things going on there. And just to tie things together a little, maybe to close out, I'm wondering, how that might also in the future influence the kind of work you're doing.
So I guess that brings me back to something I alluded to at the end of my presentation, which is that, imagine a world where we could have access to all of the app data that's collected on all of our phones all the time. Essentially, we could know everything about everybody. Like, you really wanted to go to the gym at 4 p.m. today, but right now you're starting to doubt that you're going to go. I could know that because I know it's in your calendar, and then you don't actually go because your GPS doesn't show your car at the gym or whatever. So we can know so much about people's, goals and, failed goals. We can know, we can know everything. And then that can actually be used depending on how this is used, it can be used in a bad way. So one example is, for example, a new type of credit available now for many poor people around the world, which is called digital credit, which is that now mobile phone companies can offer on the spot credit to folks who ask for it. And then they can actually do a pretty good job predicting who is going to be late at repaying. So the way you make money when you lend to people is by actually lending to people who are going to pay fees, okay? And so you want to target people who will, be able to pay the fees, but they will be late, so, you will get the fees. And so that can be very quickly predatory, okay? And so if we know too much about people, and we know too much about their behavioral biases, as we call them, economics or flows, we can really rip them off, okay? If I know that the other person who actually wants to commit and tie your hands and you're going to pay me $100 so that I can make sure that I come and wake you up on the day you need to go, jog, but then I show up and then you actually don't go jog, you just wasted the $100. I can make a lot of money off of you, and then it's not going to help you in any way because you're not going to jog anyway. So that's the danger that I'm imagining. That, and so I think that's why, as researchers, it's hard sometimes to access this data, because if it falls in bad hands, it can really be, used for purposes that may not be improving the well-being of people. And so I think we'll have to thread that fine line carefully.
Yeah, maybe the other thing I wanted to mention, maybe social media is another interesting kind of source of data that we started to look into, like trying to predict food prices by looking at tweets and looking at what people, kind of photos that people share on social media. The penetration is not great yet in especially in developing countries, and so it's not perhaps the best source of data at the moment. But I think that as sort of like people get phones are becoming more and more widespread, and people get internet access and becomes cheaper, that might be another interesting source of data. The other way to think of this is that it's the communication channels are also getting better and better. So it's not just a matter of passively sort of like collecting data, but you can also think about taking sort of like an active approach and sort of like asking people questions and kind of like doing crowdsourcing and being smart about where you collect the data from. So I think there are lots of opportunities for sort of like integrating these systems that are more passive. They're just getting the images from the satellites, feeding them into the model, to something more active where you actually probe the kind of areas that you're most uncertain about, and you kind of feed them into your model and you improve your predictions. And that I think will make things even better.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just try to close off on the broader points of avoiding the dangers that Pascaline is referencing, and focusing on, how to make the case for investing in, sustaining our life support systems. Obviously, we need that in the long run for everybody, but how do we bring it down to the individual so that we all kind of help push for that in whatever society we're in? And it's hard to get data showing in a complete way what the benefits of nature are. But there was this one survey, you guys were talking about how seldom, we survey populations in the UK that went for about 15 years, over 10,000 people, a longitudinal survey that asked them stuff each year, just many different questions about different aspects of their lives, their kind of performance on a job and economically, health, socially, physically, and the top predictor of well-being, their top two were marital status and job status, but the third one, going across all these different metrics, was access to green space. It was incredible where the people over those 15 years had moved around a bit and had variable access. And I see in a lot of this work really shining a light on the many different ways where one single way in which we benefit from nature, and one way, okay, we'll have cleaner, safer water, might in itself not be enough to drive all the change we need. But when you sum up over all of the different dimensions of well-being, it's a really powerful case.
So much. Steve, did you have one more question?
Hello. I actually had two more questions. One about more the for-profit side of what you're talking about, and one more the philanthropic side. On the for-profit side, we've heard a lot about how there is disposable income even in some of the poorest parts of the world. We know that there are entrepreneurs everywhere in the world. We've heard of the power of microfinance. We know that many of the world's great companies are seeking business opportunities in the developing world. Do you want to talk for a minute about how the sort of work you're doing to understand what's going on in the developing world might exist synergistically with finding for-profit business opportunities there?
So actually, there is not that much going on, I have to say, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is my area of expertise. There is almost no international companies going there. There's no jobs. Like, you've been studying some teenagers going through school and then looking at what happens after that, and there's a dearth of jobs. It's very hard to get jobs in manufacturing. There's no manufacturing in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I wish there were more international companies investing there. I think there's not much knowledge of Africa in general. But and then on the entrepreneurial side, I think the power of microfinance actually is not that powerful, because in the sense that most people would rather not be entrepreneurs. Most people just want to be a wage employee, and they are kind of like reluctant entrepreneurs. So they don't have a job as an employee, so they have to run a business. But it's like a tiny business, and it's never going to become Walmart. So it's essentially not that clear that unless there's kind of like more of a big influx of big capital, there's going to be much happening. I think I don't know if the corporate world reads my research. I don't. But I do hope to help generate evidence that can help increase the connectivity of developing regions especially in the global supply chain, because I think that's how people are going to be lifted out of poverty primarily, is if there is much more if Africa enters a global supply chain. And so to the extent that my work helps improve the human capital of the local populations or the governance, and this increases the palatability or the attractiveness of these regions for the corporations. I hope it can help, but I don't see my job as helping identify the very places where Joe can come and make money.
Yeah, I think I mean, we haven't seen too much interest from a big corporation. I think that the closest we've seen is like insurance companies. That seems to be there is a potential opportunity. It's a potentially big market, and just like the cost of getting the information and figuring out whether they should pay people or not is just too much. And so they are sort of like interested in this kind of inexpensive ways of keeping track of these outcomes. Unilever, that's another company that we've heard of, and then that they mentioned they saw those maps that we produced, and they were saying, oh yeah, if we had access to this a few years ago, that wouldn't have been so good because we spent so much money kind of like doing the surveys on the ground and trying to figure out what kind of products we should have been marketing in that area. So I think there are opportunities. Maybe it's just very early, and so maybe these big businesses and corporations, they are not aware of this kind of opportunities yet, but there is potential for doing more.
I'll just add briefly, we're seeing most interest on the part of, big insurance companies, certainly with climate change in the water arena. And there is a big push for transparency, more not only in supply chains, but in just overall dependence and impacts on natural capital. There's also a lot of resistance to that developing and then revealing what's, the exposure of companies to different sorts of risks that presently are difficult to see. But I think the hope is that we open up more opportunity, but I would have to agree with them working in many places around the world that most of the action is in the public sector right now and among development banks in terms of financing.
On the philanthropic side, we've seen a transition in charitable giving over the last decade or so, where the major donors of the world want to apply corporate-style ROI measures to make sure that their charitable giving is actually producing the desirable benefits that they're seeking. They're humanitarian goals, but they're seeking to measure them quantitatively. It seems like the sort of research that all three of you are doing, that you've been talking about this afternoon, really helps that in a substantial way. Do you want to talk about the way some of the world's great foundations like Gates and others are using or can use some of the output of your work to make sure that their dollars are achieving maximum benefit?
This is our last question.
Yeah, I mean, I would even go further and say, because the Gates Foundation is one of the primary founder of a lot of the research that we do. So it's almost like, so there are two ways to be sure that what you do has impact. One is to read the literature and see what has been shown to have an impact. And where, and then can I do something very similar and adapt it and get the same impact? And then you don't have to do a ton of measurement yourself. You can kind of like rely on the literature. And the other thing is to say, well, I want to do something that no one has done, and then I'm going to do it in a way that I can learn whether it makes a difference. And then you want to actually do a pretty good job at measuring it initially, measuring your impact, and have the type of simple ROI measures that you can think of that are very cheap to measure. Sometimes are not as useful as like in the short run, are understanding why something works or why it doesn't. And so you need a first kind of like big push on measurement, and then you can kind of like rely on like heuristics that are going to be simpler. Once you know something has some potential, you can rely on more simple heuristics. So I think a lot of the work that we do can be very useful there, because along the chain there are all these different ways of thinking about measurement and impacts that we contribute to. And definitely when we put stuff out, our goal is to help inform people, whether they are policymakers or philanthropists, about what's the returns to different types of investments and their complementarities.
So I'm going to close us off here. I'm also the timekeeper. Please help me in thanking Pascaline, Stefano, and Gretchen here.